Uh, Anant, with your permission, should we start? It's
Sure.
about 6:05, right? There's about, yeah.
Let's begin.
Well, I think we have a number of people who've joined us, and I'd like to welcome everybody. Good evening. And on behalf of the Daksha Fellowship, I welcome you all to this discussion on careers in law, regulation, and public policy. As you all know, we are in a time of amazing change. We were just talking about it, and the recent pandemic has only accelerated and accentuated this change. I think some of this has become cliched now because we are talking about this in every meeting and every webinar that we have. But what we are seeing is a fairly are certain trends that we wanted to kind of highlight, which is clearly a reliance on the state to drive a lot of the control of this pandemic. Increasing relevance of public policy in how the workforce should be organized and in terms of conducting business. Massive expansion of the digital realm, and I see Mahima nodding her head, and I'm sure we'll hear from her on that. And then major transitions that are taking place through which both regulation and public policy are playing an extremely important role in our lives. And that's why we kind of said, let's focus this webinar on how is the law, regulation, and public policy environment changing, and what does it mean for careers? So given that Daksha Fellowship is part of Sai University and the whole area of opportunities for young people after they study law and law-related subjects, what does this mean? And of course, this is grounded in some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that we see in the arena of the regulation of commerce and business and policy making and litigation and dispute resolution and so on, which is part of our fellowship curriculum. So I think the more fundamental question is that, and I know that Ajay feels strongly about it, is are law professionals equipped with the right knowledge and skills to cope with this change? What are the new opportunities that are opening up from a career perspective beyond the traditional legal and transactional work that we are all used to? So we've invited a very distinguished panel of people who represent all these different fields very nicely. Mr. Ajay Bahel, who is the co-founder and managing partner of AZB Partners. Ajay has over 30 years of wide-ranging experience in tax, M&A, and transaction advisory. Only 30 years, Ajay. I think I've known you longer than that, it feels like. Ajay, interestingly, is a qualified chartered accountant and is on a number of boards and so on. Dr. K.P. Krishnan. Dr. Krishnan is a former secretary to the Government of India. He's a retired IS officer, recently retired IS officer with a background in economics, who has served with distinction in various roles in the Ministry of Finance and was deeply involved in a variety of regulatory issues. Mahima Kaul, who's Director of Public Policy, India and South Asia for Twitter. Mahima and I have had the occasion to work closely together. There's also an ISB link between us, which is her spouse. She's a seasoned professional in public affairs and technology policy, who currently oversees Twitter's relationships with policymakers, elected officials, government agencies, and NGOs. And I know that Mahima does amazingly interesting work that should interest everyone. And of course, Dr. Anant Padmanabhan, who really should have been playing host. I don't know how I ended up being the moderator. I guess because today you are the law professional and I'm the guy who knows nothing about all of this. Dean of the Daksha Fellowship, well-known academic and author in the field of technology policy, intellectual rights, property rights, and innovation. So what I'll do is just go around and ask all of you a bunch of questions, and then we can take a discussion from there. So maybe I can start with law first, and this is directed to Ajay and Anand. But first, Ajay, where do you see new and emerging areas where lawyers are in demand, and what are the gaps you see in the legal profession in terms of knowledge and skills? Could we get you started with that, please? And thank you for
Right.
joining.
I don't think this is by itself going to redefine in many ways how we conduct our practice. But generally speaking, one of the areas that I have been concerned about, Pramod, and I've been saying this again and again, is that our system has become very focused on M&A transactions being the sort of basis for recognition of legal professionals. And actually, the reality is that as you grow in professionally, a lot of your clients you will find are people who may never do an acquisition, but may have the most challenging work that you will ever do. And I look at the e-commerce space, which is a very important space for us at AZB, and where I'm personally involved in a very major relationship. Prior to that, in the media space, ESPN Star Sports, they never did a single transaction, but they were the most valued client relationships, not just in terms of what that brought to the table from a commercial standpoint, but the learning. Because these were virgin territories, new areas, broadcasting was new, just as e-commerce was new. So what happens is you actually deploy some of your best professionals and your best team members in these areas, and they get the least recognition when it comes to all these legal magazines and so on and so forth, because those clients don't do transactions. And we have one of the biggest e-commerce clients right now. 90% of our work for them is not about transactions. It's about the emerging market here, the changes, pay services, the whole ecosystem and the development of the ecosystem. So that's one area I think we now owe it as professionals and as academics to continue to progress that particular area and make people feel that is important. And I'll just quickly close out by building an additional point in the context of what you said about public policy and advocacy. Once you get into that space, you get into domain much more closely than you get into a transaction. Once you get into domain, your ability to play a positive role in advocacy and in public policy is dramatic, and it's very exciting. And this environment that we are referring to right now, to me, I think that's a very, very important aspect, because there is so much we can all contribute to. And I'll talk a little bit about something specific when as we move on. So obviously, if you are a person who is doing advisory work, engaging advisory work, new areas, your ability to focus on change, what's not enough, what should change, what should happen, that becomes very heightened. And therefore, your ability to play a greater role in advocacy and development of public policy gets even greater. So I think that's why I think that particular area of practice has to be continued to be recognized, so that we can do the greater development that you're referring to into areas which this discussion is all about.
Thank you. That's very helpful. It's almost like I paid you to say that. but what I was going to go to you, Anand, but maybe with the segue here, it's a perfect time to bring Mahima into this discussion. If I may ask you, Mahima, to comment from your perspective. I mean, you are not a lawyer, right? I don't. You came into this from a very different journey, but you are at the center of this policy space and advocacy space. So, how do you see the this area of government relations, advocacy evolving, and particularly in your role in a tech firm?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, firstly. To take your question, it's been an interesting time. In your introduction, you mentioned sort of the pandemic and how we all refer to it. But truly, I think the coronavirus pandemic has brought another focus, not that we weren't focusing on the digital already, but really everybody being indoors, all your services and your entire like workflows moving online. It's sort of heightened the focus on the fact that we really need to have like last mile connectivity, right? Like that's back in play now because all the people who are not connected or they only have feature phones and they're not able to access information, give information, they were really left out of that first wave. In terms of developments that were taking place, and like even that entire the story of the migrants walking across India was not it was not actually reported in the first weeks until the footage started coming out and people were able to actually like tell those stories. So I think that's really important. The second thing is access to the internet, access, and the second thing of course is data, right? Data is back in play, like who owns the data, which companies are producing the data, how do governments want to control the data. So we were anyway talking about digital a lot, but I think there's a refocus now and an urgency in light of what's been going on. From a public policy perspective, I think these are really exciting times. There is a tension here, as these things become more important, even for our company, for example, our company and many other companies, people have been indoors and the use of the internet has gone up exponentially. I've spoken to people who are members of parliament who say, in my constituency, when I got the report, it used to be 2G, 3G, 4G. 2G, 3G are gone now. Everybody's trying to get a 4G connection. Platforms like ours are seeing a surge in user growth. So it's these are really interesting times, and in those times, I think like principle based, like what is the regulation, what is the state trying to do, what is the state trying to control, like what are the principles, what are you trying to achieve? Those have become really important questions for us at Twitter over here. Like we believe in a global open internet, and that's something like we feel that if you align to these principles, then your entire the entire advocacy that you undertake, whether it's with government directly, whether it's with other like-minded nonprofits, whether it's with the media, that is guided by your principles. So I think for people who are looking to enter, this field, especially if you're looking at digital, this is a really good time to try and study and understand what do you believe in, what do you stand for, because really this is the time when you can move the needle on some of the thoughts around this. So I don't know if that answers the question,
No, it
but
does answer. And Mahima, from your standpoint, do you see a lot of people from the legal profession entering and being involved in the work that you do and the people you work with?
yeah, absolutely. I think that we actually have a lot of lawyers in the public policy space. I find that in a lot of groups, we actually sometimes have more lawyers than we do have people who are from a humanities background or from an engineering background. I think there's a lot of scope in public policy to actually expand the definition of public policy and the kinds of people who are entering. 5 years ago, when people would come up to me and be like, "Ma'am, what do I study to get into a job like yours?" I said, "Well, I never studied public policy. Like, I sort of fell into this job from having studied political science and worked in a think tank myself. But now you can actually go and study public policy and you can actually, do a lot of relevant fellowships. So I think there are already a lot of lawyers looking at public policy. We rely a lot on lawyers as well. Because once you start, like, once you get over the principle based conversation, then you're really looking at, technicalities and what the impact is and what the compliance is. And so we definitely lean very heavily on lawyers. I feel like half a lawyer sometimes. Not a full one, but yeah, sometimes it's very deeply ingrained, at least in public policy, the way I see it.
Okay. Well, KP, if I may turn to you now, since we're sort of moving into the government realm already, and I know that you're now out of the government, but in an era of such change, right? How do you see uh, the government's role, their approach to regulation, particularly with so much change and churn happening in technology? And what opportunities, again, do you see for our young people who are aspirants for this space?
Thank you. Thanks, Pramath. Greetings to Mahima, Ajay ji, and Anand. Good to reconnect with known friends, and good to know Mahima. Pramath, if you will give me the liberty of just giving you a slight perspective on this in terms of how we evolved. If you've looked at any economy where the services begin to constitute an important, significant part of the GDP, you will see significant structural shifts in governance. And India, we have this very peculiar phenomenon that for our level of per capita income, we actually are disproportionately high on services. One immediate consequence of a services dominated economy is much higher need for consumer protection. So if you have looked at the way this has evolved, the rise of the what I would call statutory regulatory agency, because the word regulation, what government departments do at one level is also regulation. But the new hybrid structures that are now typical of a lot of our societies, agencies where Ajay will relate to this immediately, in violation of what we have historically grown up believing to be a pillar of the Indian Constitution, namely separation of powers, we are actually creating agencies which actually do the detailed legislation, they do the enforcement, and they do the adjudication. So you're talking about Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva all rolled into one, grand god. So this agency is very different from the agencies that you and I are familiar with. The Inspector of Explosives, for instance, there's an act called the Explosives Act in India, which, among other things, when you have controlled explosions, that is the entity which gives you permission. But that entity works as part of a government department. On the other hand, a SEBI or an RBI is statutorily independent. And you permit me just to give you a flavor, in the financial sector, RBI, SEBI, Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, Pension Funds Regulatory Development Authority, and we'll put insolvency and bankruptcy also in finance for convenience. So you have 5 to begin with. Infrastructure, you have Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, you have AERA, Airport Economic Regulatory Authority, you have TRI, you have RERA, the real estate guys. Take professions, you have ICAI, ICWAI, ICSI. Then you have Bar Council of India. Then you now have the new Medical Commission of India. Then you have a Dental Council, you have a Nursing Council, you have an Architects Council, and you have a statutory body created under the Companies Act called NAFRA, National Financial Reporting and Regulatory Authority. Move to education, an area that you know better than all of us. At the very minimal, UGC, AICTE, and now National Council of Vocational Education and Training. Plus, Pharma Pricing Authority, Pollution Control Board, the new Data Agency, and Pramath, I'm still on Union of India agencies. I have not yet gone to the state. So, have you seen how this landscape has changed? It is very different from the government that even Mahima would have studied in her civics class. And now, this state, what I and a colleague of mine who now heads the IBBI calls the neo state, because this agency requires skill sets of a kind which the previous state did not require. You require lawyers, but lawyers working with domain experts. Because if you are writing a privacy related regulation, you need, in fact, 3 sets of elements: law, public policy, and the technical domain, and so on. So I think careers in this space are going to explode, as they have in various parts of the world. And they will explode within the agencies, they will explode outside of the agencies. And what traditionally used to be standard sort of bad word, lobbying, will transform in India, because there is genuine, serious participatory and advocacy role of users, of interacting entities. So the nature of this landscape is undergoing a tectonic shift. And I think Daksha and the people behind it should seize this moment with 2 hands, because this opportunity is truly unique. I'll stop here. I can go on for a while, but I think it will be more interactive and fun if we have a conversation. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's a very very useful perspective. I mean, I had not thought of it that way. We all end up dealing with a lot of these agencies that you listed, and as you were listing them, I was saying, oh my God, there's so many of them. For Sai University and Daksha, we are dealing with Bar Council, and somewhere else you're dealing with Competition Commission. Somewhere to make foreign exchange payments, you're dealing with RBI. So I think it's amazing actually how many of these we deal with on a daily basis and not realize. But you're absolutely right that whole landscape has completely changed. Anand, to quickly bring you in, because you've been at the center of some of these intersections, if I may call it, and you are the lawyer here. So how has it been for you when you first graduated from the National Law School to where you are now? What has it felt like as a youngish lawyer amongst some
Right.
of us?
Thanks, Pramath, and thank you all. Really mapping this whole terrain, and I think there's a lot of change. In fact, everything that Mr. Bell and Dr. K.P. Krishnan and Mahima mentioned is in many ways reflective of the transition that I have seen in the last 12 to 13 years since I graduated from NLS in 2007. I mean, really been a sea change. One is, of course, the technology transition. I'm not sure whether Twitter existed when I graduated. Maybe it did, but it was definitely not as influential as it is, today. And the same goes for a Facebook, for a Netflix, Swiggy. You come to the Indian startup scene, a lot of our unicorns. So I think that a lot of work too has, as a result of this, been generated, which we were not really oriented. In fact, at that point, I remember we had one law and technology committee, and we used to organize one conference annually, and there was one journal called the Indian Journal of Law and Tech. Today, the same university, you go back, every month, I'm sure there is some conference or the other around cryptocurrencies, Internet of Things. So really the space, like Mahima pointed out, has exploded, and I think the pandemic is in fact the testament to the fact that we are all set to reorganize the way we interact with the world and how our economic and social ordering is undergoing massive transitions. The second point is going back to what Ajay was mentioning. We were really oriented in a certain direction to think about our careers as either litigation or entering the transactional space. I mean, these are the two real options that we had in front of us. And of course, in certain cases, you go in-house, but the in-house options were still quite limited. So broadly, entering a law firm as part of the M&A or capital markets team or private equity team, or going and joining a senior lawyer or an advocate on record. Today, if you look at careers as presented before NLS grads, NALSAR grads, and so on, I think there are so many more opportunities even within law firms. There are specific teams, such as, for instance, the technology, media, and telecom team. In many firms, these teams have become much bigger than what they were 10 to 12 years ago. And similarly, the regulatory practice teams, right? So, as Dr. K.P. Krishnan mentioned, there are so many regulators. So, as the number of regulators grow, there are also so many more avenues for lawyers to appear before these tribunals or regulatory authorities, as well as, of course, do that pejorative job, which is lobbying, which I'm sure in India is going to increasingly find more acceptance, as we understand that it is nothing but another form of advocacy. So where do lawyers really fit in? And I mean, I'd like to reference one of my professors, Dr. U.R. Rai, who many years ago, when teaching us constitutional law, said, law is nothing but specialized common sense. And in fact, I was recently reading a piece written by Ajay on LinkedIn Pulse, where he mentioned something very similar, that a lot of these skills are not rocket science. But we have to teach both of these things. I mean, common sense too can be taught. And you at Harappa, Pramath, you're doing a fantastic job of some of that, right? And what we are doing at Daksha Fellowship is really integrating these two elements, and we can speak more about that later.
So Ajay, I know that you wanted to add to what you had said earlier, and I know that you got this. I think Anant has set you up nicely. I know that you, on one hand, always said that, there are these real fundamental skills that lawyers are in fact in need of. One view is that if you're going to go through multiple different verticals, then the foundation has to be very strong. Yet there seems to be a need for some specialization. So how should people think about that?
See, I think specialization is certainly something that's necessary, but I'm concerned about the legal profession going the same path as the medical profession, where today all of us are crying for the general practitioner, which my father was, and I know how holistic his advice was to a patient. And I'm not saying that the specialists don't give good advice, but they are very focused. The learning, to my mind, I saw this when I was practicing as a chartered accountant, and I thought I knew everything about tax. And then the client would say, "Vakil saab ke paas jana hai," and you go to a guy who's never done a tax matter in his life, and you go there, as a typical chartered accountant, and yeah, I know everything. What is this guy going to teach me? And suddenly he picks up a point, and it bugs you that guy, how the hell has he thought about this? I mean, he doesn't know tax, but you suddenly realize that a fresh look at something throws up an idea which you may not have thought of if you have this over-specialized approach. So the way we look at it is, we have cut out the word expert in our firm. We've always, in our firm, we're very clear. Expert to me is a person who's plateaued. So I always tell people, when you say you're an expert in tax or you're an expert in this area or e-commerce, please don't do that. I don't take it as a compliment. I actually treat that as being almost a guy who's now got nothing to learn. So, because life is a learning process. So the way we look at it is, you must have a strong foundation in law. You should not be embarrassed about the fact that I do many areas of law. Today people are embarrassed because the way it's come out, 16 different areas, private equity, mergers and acquisitions. What's the difference? A private equity deal is, at the end of the day, how is it any different from a joint venture or from a different kind of transaction? But you go through this, and I see people in my office, they're filling up their resumes, and after the 5th item, they say, "Sir, if we add another 6th and 7th, I've done so much litigation, but if I had litigation, so people will think I'm not a serious lawyer." So that's what worries me. So the way we look at it is, specialization is necessary, but specialized lawyers within our organization or any organization should not forget that there is a huge amount of learning that can come from the non-specialized lawyers in other verticals. And therefore, they should not treat themselves as the last word. As we said, and as I wrote, Anand referred to the article and I sent it to you, I said, lawyers who are specialists should wear their specialist hat lightly so that information and knowledge can actually proliferate there. And the objective is an end product which is better than what it should have been when you started. Whether it's, I'll give you a classic example today. We talk about intellectual property law. If a brand internationally is sold, which has a footprint in India, there is a potential tax consequences. There is a decision of Foster's which said that there is a concept of residential domestic goodwill that is created. So every country must have an exercise ability to tax, and then Delhi High Court took a different view. But just imagine now the implications of that. You have Coke. Coke is sold in so many countries. Every country where you introduce a product, if Mont Blanc before it came to India would have a certain sale value overall internationally, after it comes to India to distributors, will have another sale value. So clearly there is residential domestic goodwill. Now, an intellectual property lawyer by itself will, they're doing a brand sale, never even cross their mind. And we have now got our lawyers so attuned to this issue that if there's a brand or some aspect involved, they'll pick up the phone and say, "Hang on a minute, should I be telling the client that there could be a potential tax issue that you should be looking at?" So that's what I mean by cross-pollination of practice. Everybody gains from that, the client gains, and you gain incremental knowledge. So I think, that is how we need to have people working on this issue. People are today, I'll tell you, we talk about careers, tax. It is the most underexploited area. Pramad, the development of the tax professional practice has been so poor that even today, maybe at least till 5 years ago, the people who were practicing, who were known, were the same people who were in practice when I was practicing as a chartered accountant. I went to Bangalore, there was a session on Vodafone. I went to NLS and I was moderating, and there were 5 people who had come, and I asked people, and this is when Vodafone decision was delivered by the Bombay High Court. That decision was 90% corporate law, 10% tax. because it was about piercing the corporate veil, circumstances where you pierce the corporate veil. It's corporate law, common sense, corporate law, tax was a little bit. So I made the mistake of asking them how many people have read the judgment since we've got so many people here. One person raised his hand who was also happened to be from AZB and was visiting to hear me speak. And of course, I was castigated by my partners that you were very harsh on these kids, they all felt very bad. I said, but I mean, it's crazy. 5 people have come there because they thought it's a tax judgment, they didn't touch it. So forget about looking for careers beyond areas, in esoteric areas. An area like tax, Anand will bear me out. There is more development taking place. Nobody is looking at that. Finance, cost. Today, Prabhat, I tell every law college, 5-year law college, that if you have people captive for 5 years, you should produce them as at least 40% as a chartered accountant. 5 years in-house is phenomenal. We did chartered accountancy where there was no curriculum actually. There was no classroom. You just did course, study right after college, and you sat for these papers. There was no classroom teaching. Here you got a classroom where you got kids residential for 5 years. So the profession, the teaching of the profession has to evolve so that we broad base and first give them that strength before we get into this, technology and so on and so forth, which is important. First, give them the basic skills which every business will need. So I think there's a great amount of opportunities, but a great amount of rethinking has to be done even at the college level. I've been speaking to some of the, the deans, etc., and some of them are open to the idea. Many of them, I think, suffer from this problem that this is not an area I'm familiar with, so shirk from, taking it forward.
Well, I think in a way, in many ways, what you're saying resonates with our plans at SAI. I think where it doesn't resonate or doesn't seemingly resonate is that maybe we are starting a little bit backwards, because since we are starting with a postgraduate program, we are assuming this foundation is already there.
Yes.
And then we are trying to qualify people in this law, technology, policy, mediation kind of disciplines. But I think that fundamentally we agree with you completely, and it is a little bit like the Ashoka approach. Right? The foundation has to be so strong that you should be able to move from one field to the other field quite seamlessly.
Yeah. So, but you have an opportunity here, Prabhat, as even at a post, sorry to interrupt, you could certainly start a postgraduate, which I know Jindal has recently announced, which involves finance and accounting. So even if they have lost the 5 years, the fact is if you introduce something like that for postgraduate, then people who are in college will start thinking about this and saying, hang on a minute, I've got this one course where I can sharpen my skills. So maybe in the first 5 years where I've got the time, let me read up a little bit about accounts and read a few balance sheets, etc. So I can actually sit in this course and understand it. So I don't think that you can't contribute to it. If you just thought about adding additional verticals in Daksha, you could probably achieve the same objective that I'm referring to.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we are actually doing in Daksha is actually going back and strengthening the fundamentals. So while we are actually helping them prepare for a more tech and policy and mediation kind of discipline, we are also making sure that we strengthen those things that are missing in the undergraduate.
Right.
Anand, would you like to comment on that? You agree with that, right?
No, in fact, totally. In fact, so if you look at the Daksha curriculum, the initial phase of Daksha, which is now going to be run fully online till December, has courses on finance, accounting, research methods, public policy, and data and decision making. So we felt that this cluster is really important to bring lawyers to a certain point in their learning trajectory where they can understand client needs in a more holistic manner. So that's the thinking, and then we begin the pathway courses.
Mahima, what do you think the education system has to do to enable the kind of capabilities that you see being needed in companies like yours, or in the kind of activities that you are engaging in?
I work for a very unusual kind of company. So I think that sometimes my experience and my thought process is very limited to just how Twitter works. And so for me, I'll take a little opposite view, which is, see,
So can I
yeah,
interrupt you? And I'm sorry to
yeah,
do
yeah,
this,
yeah,
but can you give our audience a little bit of granularity on what is it that you do, right? So when
yeah.
people say public policy at Twitter or companies like yours, what does it mean? What is it that you do? What is your objective? What does you do on your day-to-day basis?
Yeah, happy to explain that because it is a little bit unusual the way we go around doing public policy. So I'll split up my job into like say four broad categories, right? So the first one is the one that you can probably guess, which is we attend, we sort of talk to government about the rules, regulations, laws that they're thinking about. They're thinking around when especially if it impacts us or impacts the sector. We represent Twitter at these meetings, senior level meetings, different kinds of meetings. We give our input. So that's sort of like I would say this regular kind of work that we do with the government, stakeholders. The second would be that we have, a Twitter for Good program. So that's really like sort of the things that Twitter stands for. Like we stand for an open internet. We think Twitter is like an essential utility, especially in times of crisis. Online safety is a big aspect for us. So we do a lot of programs and we work with a lot of interesting organizations who are in the tech sector in some ways, but they're looking at different pockets of it. So it may be women oriented, children oriented, terrorism, the issue of terrorism and counter speech. And we basically have programs with all of them. So that would be a nonprofit and civil society part of it. The third would be Twitter is also a platform, right? And so governments use Twitter. And so right from the prime minister down to the local DM wants to use Twitter. So we have a team that actually like works with them in terms of how they can use the platform better and what kind of interesting things they can do. So that's when we actually really do a lot of interface in the government. And obviously the last couple of months, I was hoping it would be, maybe a little relaxed, but not at all because coronavirus meant that Twitter was one of the essential crisis communication platforms. And so we ended up doing a lot of very intense work with not just the central but state governments in terms of how they were talking to people. And I think the fourth is like I take all these different types of interactions, all the feedback that we're getting, and then we funnel it into our teams, right? And we funnel it in back into the company where we think around issues of like what are the decisions we can make, which we tweak the platform in a particular way, and what does that say about free expression? How does that play out in a particular country? Because we are also one product company, right? Twitter is just Twitter. We don't have a different banking, e-commerce, and nor do we have Twitter for India and Twitter for America. It's largely broadly the same platform. So when we're making a decision to introduce a new feature or a new policy, we have to think about the impacts that it has in different cultural contexts. And so, me and my team are sort of centrally involved with thinking around those things. So it is a very broad job. And just because there's, people who are looking at careers in public policy, I had a crazy CV. Like I definitely did not have like a mainstream I've only done public policy. I've studied public policy, and that's why I'm in this job kind of CV. I'd worked as a journalist. I'd worked as a think tank. I'd spent a lot of time on the ground covering stories around how technology was impacting society. So I spent a hell of a lot of time in, villages and small towns, just, capturing case studies. So a lot of people who would normally see my CV would be like, wow, you've done a bunch of different things. I know the theme is the same, but like, where's the common thread? But when I had the Twitter interview with Colin, my ex-boss. I mean, he saw it and he said, this is perfect. Because I needed to be talking to nonprofits, I needed to be talking to government, I needed to be talking to these people. And so your experience makes sense. So in a way, I think to answer the original question that you asked, I think there's a danger sometimes of thinking that like you just need to be so academic in your approach that I want to study public policy and do a bachelor's and a master's in public policy that you won't end up having any experiences to bring to your job to have a perspective that you can use, which will be interesting to actually move something in a positive direction. So as much as you want to study and get those degrees, like I just feel like experience and like sometimes going with the flow and trying something different can help. I mean, you're talking about lawyers. My mom did law when she was 40. And I found that, just because she'd had all these other work experiences, uh, it was an interesting angle that she was able to bring versus a 20-year-old who's never done business or gone for any other kind of meeting. So I'll take the other view and
Actually,
see. Yeah.
if I may bring up to you some, KP, thank you. He's already been answering a lot of the questions on our Q&A box. But there's one which says, how can I get a head start into public policy? It seems that organizations are always looking for prior experience. So there's always a chicken and egg problem. I think you've sort of answered that, but would you like to take that more directly and say what is your view on that? What would you advise people?
Yeah, I think like it depends on the size of the organization, right? Like with Twitter, we have smaller teams, so we may be looking for people with prior experience. If you approach a bigger company and they're looking for they've got a big team, they may be okay with just you having studied something and then coming into their team. But if you need to get that prior experience, I think there are many organizations which are in the nonprofit sector, which are tech law, think tanks, and they are working on these issues. So there are many different ways to get that kind of experience that then takes you to a job with a bigger platform. I mean, that is what I would say is the way. Like sometimes you might find that right job and they'll take you in straight away, but sometimes that experience is really valuable and that network and experience that you come with. And so think about that a little bit. Just be creative about how you think about it.
KP, any further points around? I thought you painted an amazing picture of what's going to happen in the government. What might be opportunities to prepare oneself for those kind of roles? Is there anything specific that you would suggest to our students and law graduates?
Yeah. Number one, if you see the evolution of all these organizations, to begin with, given their sort of umbilical cords with government, they all start with large numbers of seconded officers from government. So the organized civil services are, you take the first chairman of SEBI, the first 5 executive directors, typically deputationists from the administrative service, income tax service, customs, etc. And you will see this trend across agencies. It takes a while. 10, 12 years later, other than the very top, the bulk of the organization begins to be internal staff of the organization, and this arm's length requirement, which is also a necessary requirement because these are agencies which may often be resolving disputes where government itself is a disputant. So the arm's length relationship also requires that the number of deputationists come down. And over a period of time, and the RBI is doing this, and we know some other agencies that are doing it, if you want to get a grip on what's happening in fintech, there is no hope in hell to find this talent in any public agency. You necessarily need to go out and look for people. So it's very interesting. All these organizations are now figuring out flexible methodologies for recruiting people. So there are, and this is again completely in keeping with things that have happened elsewhere in the world. Regulatory agencies have always been, quote unquote, and you're familiar with this, of having revolving doors. So the investment banker comes into the SEC, then goes into investment banking. I'm not necessarily advocating this as a method because that has a whole bunch of pitfalls. But with appropriate checks and balances, this business of not being in a career in an agency for life will begin to happen increasingly in India. So I see fairly decent number of entry as well as middle level positions in a number of these organizations happening. So that's within government. But coming outside of government, just building on what Mahima was telling us, almost all these quote unquote new age companies have a decent team which works on regulatory and public policy sort of verticals. And these are not our old open doors to North Block folks people. These are domain people who are researching, who are working with government, but in a much more healthy manner than influencing that individual transaction. But they are in the business of advocacy. They will have a viewpoint. That's entirely legitimate as long as all parties know about this. So private sector and think tank careers in this sector will also increase hugely in numbers. So in terms of job opportunities, to complete where I had left in the previous intervention, I think numbers will increase. But where I want to partially disagree with Mahima is, Mahima may be an exception who managed to fit into this role very well. But I think a large number of the sort of the army in this new setup will need to be professionally trained. So you need solid grounding in microeconomics. You need to know the distinction between public goods and private goods. What is the role of the regulatory agency? The role of the regulatory agency is not product approval, but consumer protection. So there is, I think, a grounding that is required in a lot of humanity disciplines, economics, certainly mathematics and statistics, because this is a field where you're going to be dealing with very serious data interpretation, data analytics. But you need to do this with some knowledge of the domain. And therefore, political science, political theory, sociology, besides a reasonable grounding in constitution and law. So this ideal public policy / regulatory affairs person will necessarily be somewhat well trained in these 5-6 disciplines, not an expert in any of them. Once he or she, let's say, gets into Twitter, in 6 to 8 months, he or she will be an expert in the area that Twitter needs him to be an expert in. But you have the basic grounding that tomorrow, if you are going to be dealing with commodity markets regulation, and how do you help soybean farmers in some interior Madhya Pradesh district take advantage of the commodities futures market, you have the basic equipment to be able to jump out of Twitter into commodities market regulation. So your specialization is regulation, and it is a field which is now evolving as an area of specialization. There will be a domain sort of topping on the basic regulation, but that's the way I see it evolving.
And so this specialize in regulation and what we call public policy, is there a difference or is it roughly the same?
I would think there is a minor difference, because public policy is the macro, regulation is, public policy is broadly about state intervention. Now, state intervention can take many forms. One dominant form of today of state intervention is regulation. So
Right.
In a sense, regulation is a subset, public policy is the set.
Right. Okay, that's helpful. I'm also learning today. Ajay, there's a question about tax law and its interface with public policy. Can you clarify that a little bit?
See, public policy, as KP said, has relevance in any area. I think there's one point I want to make here, and KP touched upon it already about this opening of doors. I think one of the things that people have to learn is the distinction between lobbying and advocacy. I've had the occasion, I don't have anywhere near the experience of KP, but I am working with a lot of government departments now. I'm on committees where we are, formulating policy, SFIO manuals, investigation manual. What I have found is that they are concerned about what they hear if they believe that it is motivated and directed at the benefit of a few. Whereas what they are actually looking at, which KP alluded to, is the larger public good. So, I fully understand Mahima's role. She's in a company. Her role is to push the company. But we have this all the time. We have clients who have to push their agenda as well. But when they come and we interact together, we have found better results. Even for a client, when they've gone with a broader agenda, even if some parts of what they are actually advocating are detrimental to them, because they have to recognize that if the government has to work, the government cannot work and only benefit a few. The government has to have a broader agenda to take care of the larger public good, in which obviously private good will also be involved, but it cannot be in conflict. So I think that's one lesson and test for anybody, since we're talking about policy, that you've got to look at that issue from a point of view of what's good for the nation, what's good for the country. In that context, take tax policy, for example. Similar role is available. There are many cases, Pramad, where we brought to the notice of the government loopholes which should be plugged. And they have expressed surprise that, how is it that you guys on the other side are bringing? I said, why do you think we are on the other side? We are as much Indians as you are. I don't want somebody else to have a hole where his tax or her tax is not paid, because all of us who are here who are taxpayers will bear the burden. So if you have to move beyond lobbying, and if you truly understand and wish to work on tax policy, there is a huge amount of opportunities. Mediation, tax settlements, bringing international practices on a non-motivated basis. There's a great opportunity. Tax law has to evolve significantly in India. I'm not talking about just the taxability, but in terms of settlements. We have the most adversarial regime, which we keep coming up with a settlement plan. Like everywhere else in the world, you can sit across the revenue officer and settle matters. We don't have that kind of regime. So there is a huge opportunity in public policy and tax direction. But the person has to keep in mind the larger good of the nation. It can't be this policy is focused at a few corporates and that's where I want to come and take a role. No, it has to be a broader basis if it is going to make any headway within the government. That's at least my experience.
Well, that's very well put. And, I almost see a connection between what you just said and what you started out with. That you are almost exhorting us to say that as lawyers, as public policy advocates, while it's great to look at the equivalent of transactions or representing your client or pushing an agenda, that we all actually have the opportunity to step beyond that and look at the larger good, right? And that's where whatever becomes policy, right? Because you are actually going to recommend something in the larger good of the country and the citizens and so on. That's a powerful idea. I mean, at least for me,
I found that to be the most successful. I have been interacting over the last 5 or 6 years with regulators more than I've ever done before. I found that very, very successful. If they are satisfied that you are not coming there because you are pushing some particular agenda of a particular person, they are very, very open to listening. I'm sure KP will bear that out, because all these years they've been used to people coming for exactly the opposite. Ki mera kaam kar do.
Listen, it's a Saturday evening. We are almost at 7. I don't want to detain you all too much, but may I have just 2 minutes of summaries from each one of you? Where one of the big questions that people are asking is specific opportunities. These are young people who come from very interesting backgrounds. Some are lawyers, some want to go into policy. So a quick summary of any last remarks, but also any specific opportunities that you see as advice, if you had to give guidance to our audience on where the opportunities might be, what would you tell them? And Mahima, may I put you on the spot and ask to start off with you? By the way, you noticed that KP called you an exception. He just stopped short, sort of saying you are exceptional, which I would say that, that's why you've been able to get to where you are. But he's also suggested an alternative career for you in managing the markets of the agriculture produce while I was in the south.
No, I will skip that one for now. But just to give more light into, I think, the way, say, a recruiter hires, but it would be similar across at least certain types of tech companies. Especially, we deal with free expression and content, and the phone is in your hand. What you express is very important to you. I think that puts us sometimes in conflict with the state, sometimes in conflict with, or sometimes working with the state, depending on what's being said and who's saying it. But let me sort of illustrate the kind of people who are on our teams. So we have people, obviously they've all studied and they've done degrees in various aspects. They can be from human rights organizations That's the kind of person who would join our team. It could be a lawyer. It could be somebody who worked in the industry association, so they really understand how that industry association piece works. They could be from an engineering background, but now want to get into public policy because they understand what tech can enable, but they want to be closer to what the impact of that is. So at least in the tech sector, public policy is really influenced by multiple types of impacts, not just impact for a particular company. Of course, if you're working for a company, you are going to be deeply involved with that, but really the impact on, I think, digital, on societies, how the state and private citizens are interacting. And so it is made and it is done in collaboration, not just with external people, but even internal. That diversity is what's going to make it stronger, your perspective stronger. So there are a lot of interesting opportunities for people. So do study public policy as well. But even if you're coming from another school, don't feel like you may not get in without doing a particular degree. I did a couple of fellowships because I did my master's quite a long time ago. So I do fellowships and things from time to time to just be able to be attached to a university. I'd love to take some time off and do my PhD or something at some point, but now I think it's a pipe dream the way things are going.
Mahima, the
But thank
Daksha
you.
Fellowship is only 1 year. You can take a sabbatical
Yeah,
and join us.
yeah, maybe soon.
KP, any?
Yeah, yeah. So, in a sense, summarize, but with very specific. Agencies are going to grow in number. Agencies are going to grow in size. Deputations in agencies will reduce. They will become more arm's length. To give an illustration, massive direct recruitment advertisement of the SEBI recently for entry-level positions, which is you just open any LinkedIn type site, you will see these advertisements. CCI, IBBI, all of these are recruiting people, entry level as well as middle level people who come on secondments. Number one. Number two, these are all fixed term positions. So welcome to the new world where even government is not recruiting for lifetime employment. So this is, I think, going to be a defining sort of a change even within India, which means the individual will have to keep evolving, and that's the government side. On the sort of the outside of the government, outside of the public agencies, clearly public policy, the very fact that a number of us on a Saturday evening are actually discussing public policy as a career and not discussing it as a career within the IAS is an indicator of where we are. And the fact that other than me, there is nobody else in this panel who's actually government, and we are discussing careers in public policy is telling you where India is headed. So public policy as a career has moved out of the confines of government. So besides firms like Mahimas and besides law firms like Ajay's, industry bodies, large numbers of industry bodies now employ these people. Plus, this new sort of breed of entities. For instance, Pramath, you're familiar with the National Skill Development Corporation. Just to give an example, a public-private company, 51% equity with private sector, and therefore recruitment pattern entirely styled on private sector style. Chairman, Mr. Nayak of L&T, and 40 sector skill councils funded, created by them. All of them are private companies, but these companies have the power to assess and certify individuals in skill, and that certificate is a sovereign backed, sovereign approved certificate. So you have a bunch of agencies which recruit. They don't recruit in hundreds, but they recruit in decent sizes. So outside of government, specific one or two examples I've given. In a longer session, one can give more. One additional sort of sentence, if you permit me a minute, I want to build on what Ajay said, and I think he drew some important cautions. We've seen this evolve in the rest of the world. So ethics is going to be a very important part of the training as a public policy professional, because this, the government is always an entity that you don't want to embrace when you are not inside the government. You want to be at some kind of a length if you are not an insider, because the line between advocacy, lobbying, pushing a transaction will be very thin, and very good grounding in ethics. And companies will have these, but individuals to be sort of well trained in these is, I think, important. And over a period of time, begin to specialize, because you will then become an expert in an area, and it need not be a very narrowly defined area. It could be public policy / regulation in agriculture, public policy / regulation in IT, or in financial sector. So I think that's broadly the advice I'll have for a lot of the youngsters who've tuned in.
No, thank you, KP. Ajay, let you go next in case you have to step off, and Mahima and KP, if you have to step off, it's 7:05. But please go ahead, Ajay.
So I completely echo what KP is saying. We have to, I think it's a huge opportunity. I won't say in a law firm that we would hire people just for public policy, but we would, a person who's a lawyer who has public policy experience would certainly be very welcome. Obviously, we expect them to do other work. But very important, we must not ape the training of other parts of the world where lobbying is an acceptable practice. People should be clear in their mind that what works in India and what will work in this new age India, which KP is referring to, has to be advocacy which is broad based, ethical, and which is not based on lobbying. So I think as we draw the training, we have to be very careful that we don't import Western trainings, not because there's anything wrong, but they work in that part of the world. That's fine. You could be a lobbyist in Washington, and that's fine. That's your job. But that, I don't think, is what the new India and the new interface between India, the building of trust requires. So I think what people need to look at is public policy, advocacy is all about building trust. And therefore, if you are going to be trained, you have to be trained that building trust means you have to give a lot, you have to think what will appeal to the other person as something you've in fact picked up, where you think it should not be a part, even though it's good for what you think in the immediate term, but it's not good, as I said, for the nation. And that distinction, building up that rapport, is very important. So that training of how you train people has to be made very much India specific, based on how we operate in India. So that, I think, is something that whoever is going to impart this training must keep in mind.
Very high quality points you all have made. I'm really taking those points away as something, Anant, that we need to really factor in whatever we do. And I'll let you have the last word since you are building this fellowship.
Sure. So, Pramath, I mean, for the last 4 months, I've been urging students to apply to the fellowship, because in many ways, these are some of the career trajectories that we are looking to open up. And when I was listening to everyone, I was actually thinking, where are the teachers? I mean, that's a great opportunity, right? Academia and research. I mean, these areas, the moment they open up professionally and provide a lot more opportunities to candidates, I think some of them could even really start thinking about building an academic career, a research career, which sort of incorporates all these elements and can really pave the path to a more interdisciplinary learning, which I think is where legal education must be headed, looking at all these insights. So I'm sure that we will, really learn a lot as we go along the Daksha journey and incorporate these ideas, and looking forward to that. It's quite exciting.
I'd like to thank you all for sparing time on a Saturday evening, and please have a safe and wonderful weekend. And I hope you will not feel awkward if we were to impose upon you again once we actually have our Daksha Fellows on campus or in the virtual world to speak to them. But thank you very, very much. This has been a very high quality discussion, and I know that there were a lot of questions which didn't go answered, but I think somewhere we did attempt to address those questions in the discussion that happened. We had over 100 people join us today, so that's wonderful. And again, I want to thank you. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.